Guys, I'm currently in Harleston, and this right here is a nuclear war bunker. Should we get down there and have a look? Go on then.
There's a small structure beside Hazelaw Lane not far from Alford that most people would normally pass without giving it much thought. Because from the surface it doesn't look like anything major, but beneath the little entrance was once part of Britain's Cold War warning system. This was Royal Observer Corps underground monitoring post. Usually linked with Harleston, and it was reportedly in use from 1959 until 1991. It wasn't a public shelter, and it wasn't some huge military bunker full of soldiers. It was a small working post, built underground so that trained local volunteers could survive long enough to measure the effects of a nuclear attack, and report that information back into the wider warning network. That's the strange thing about this place, because today you've got fields, passing traffic and everything else normal about a normal country lane. But under the ground was a room built for one of the darkest possibilities of the 20th century. The Royal Observer Corps has started out long before the nuclear age, with its original job being to watch the skies, spot aircraft and identify them, before reporting the movements. And during the Second World War, that work became a vital part of Britain's air defence system. But after the war, the threat changed. By the 1950s, Britain was preparing for the possibility of a nuclear attack, and the Royal Observer Corps changed with it, moving from a wartime system of aircraft spotting into a Cold War network that could help confirm nuclear explosions, estimate the strength and pass that information through the country's warning system. That's why posts like this were built, not to stop an attack, and not because anyone thought nuclear war would be survivable enough in any normal sense. Because if the worst happened, someone still had to take readings and tell the rest of the country what was going on. The Hazelaw Lane post was manned by Royal Observer Corps volunteers, not full-time soldiers, and that detail matters, because it turns this from a Cold War object into a local human story. The local Harleston crew was made up of around a dozen men and women, led by Chief Observer Peter Sanders, who worked at Reliant Motors in Tamworth, with training carried out by leading observer Alec Gibson, whose brother Ron Gibson was also part of the crew. These were just normal people with normal jobs, families and routines, but if the alarm came, they were expected to make their way here, climb down into the post and begin the work they'd trained for. Usually 3 observers would be on duty at any time, working from a small underground room roughly the size of a spare bedroom, with basic supplies such as rations and water. There's also a chemical toilet, telephone equipment, and enough batteries to keep the post going. It wasn't comfortable and it weren't built for long-term living, because these places were practical, cramped and very limited, designed for function rather than anything else. One instrument called the bomb power indicator measured the pressure wave from a nuclear blast, helping estimate the strength of the explosion, while another, the ground zero indicator, helped work out the direction of a nuclear burst. There was also radiation monitoring equipment, so the observers could take fallout readings. They'd take these from inside the post rather than keep going outside, exposing themselves to the dangers. And that really was the art of the work. Not to stop anything from happening and not to rush out into the aftermath like an emergency service, but to stay underground, record what the instruments were showing, work out where the danger was moving and report that information back into the wider network while there's still time for it to matter. The information from this post would have fed into a much wider system, because Hazelaw Lane was part of No. 8 Coventry Group, linked locally with posts at Polesworth and Church Gresley in what was known as November Cluster, with the wider group headquarters at Church Lawford near Rugby. This post was also classed as a master post, which meant it had VHF radio, as well as a normal telephone. And that mattered because in a nuclear attack, phone lines could fail, so radio gave the crew another way of getting information back into the network. And that's what makes this place feel so odd. Standing in this lane today, nothing made me feel like it suggests nuclear war. But for decades, this small underground room was part of Britain's plan for what happened after a nuclear strike, and not before it. The underground position gave the crew some protection from radioactive fallout, because after a nuclear explosion there was dust, soil and building material that could be pulled up into the blast cloud, becoming radioactive, and then it could fall back across the landscape depending on the wind and the weather. So even places that had not been directly hit could still become dangerous. And that's why these readings mattered, because radiation levels and fallout movement could affect towns, villages, roads and farms, not forgetting the people trying to survive in them. But that protection had limits. These were not luxury survival bunkers, and they were not places built with the idea that everyone could be saved, because the system was based on something much colder and more practical. If a nuclear attack happened, someone had to survive long enough to describe it. The Hazelaw Lane post stayed active until 1991, when the Cold War was coming to an end and Britain no longer needed the same network of underground monitoring posts. After that, many of the ROC posts were locked, abandoned or damaged. This one was unfortunately burnt out, but there's a small number of these remaining that have been restored, and that's why this little structure beside Hazelaw Lane is worth noticing. It was not a secret hideout and it was not a public bunker, but a working Cold War monitoring post manned by local volunteers and linked directly into the national warning system. It was built for a moment that everyone hoped would never come. How long until this one gets turned into an Airbnb? Play some now.